There's nothing more annoying. There's another conception again that this is a fine country. You know, there's these t-shirts that say you get fined for everything, jaywalking or spitting or whatever. It's not true.
Meet Jane, a Brit who first lived briefly in Singapore as a child in 1963, and after spending years in Europe and America, she moved back to Singapore 25 years ago. Jane shared what it's like living in Singapore compared to the US, whether Singapore is truly a police state, and if Singaporeans really lack sense of humor. I'm Chernov, your insider to Expat Life. Let's go! What do you think the biggest misconceptions about Singapore?
That there's nothing interesting here, that it's a sterile environment, that it's modern buildings and nothing else, that there's no sense of humour. There are so many different views about Singapore, which, you know, I particularly, the reason I started my little business 8.5 years ago was really to dispel that notion for visitors coming to Singapore, overseas visitors, because I felt they were only being shown those kinds of things, you know, like...
Yeah, people go to MBS.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, MBS is very impressive, but you know, it's not real Singapore.
Yeah.
And so you know, my whole sort of raison d'etre behind having a little business that I run is to show people the real Singapore and to show them that actually there's a lot of interesting stuff here. And I'm delighted to say that many people, when they write their very complimentary reviews of their tours, say, "Wow, I had no idea there was so much there." And I've fallen in love with the place and I'm coming back for more, kind of thing, which of course is, you know, mission accomplished if that happens. So yeah, showing them that we're a small island, we're a relatively young island, but an awful lot has happened here in that time, not least because we have people coming from all over the world populating the place, which makes it interesting. You know, we've got Chinese culture, Malay culture, Indian culture, Eurasian culture, we've got all kinds of Peranakan culture, we've got lots of European influences from all over the world. And I think that makes it interesting. Yes, of course, we do plan the city very well, which is just as well because we're 6 million people living in, you know, 720 square kilometres. If we didn't plan it, it would be chaotic. But I think, you know, there are a lot of genuine things here, real things here, if you like. Basically, Raffles was very keen on town planning. I think he'd quite appreciate our Urban Redevelopment Authority these days, because that's what basically looks after all our urban planning these days. Because he said, I want to have it organised. I want to have this side of the river for the government. I want the other side of the river to be for business. And over here you've got the European merchants and so forth, and the Malays are going to go over to what we call Kampong Glam these days. Yeah. And we have the Chinese and the Indians on the other side of the river because they can do business on the river. He liked it to be organised. And yeah, I think he would approve of Singapore's modern urban planning very much.
Speaking of urban planning,
yeah.
So basically in a couple of months, here, exactly where we are walking, will be the track for Formula One.
Absolutely.
Which is freaking impressive.
Yeah, the Anderson Bridge, you will see, it's always very clear. You see, which we're just about to walk over, is very, very clear in the race. Yep. Yeah. They will be flying over here at crazy speeds and so forth.
Okay, someone says Singapore is sterile, Singapore is boring. Let's break this notion.
No, it's not boring. If you start actually going around the island and you discover that there are many historic places here. I say our history is relatively short. If you just count the 14th century, which I do not, of course, because I want to talk about the 14th century here in Singapore when we had 5 Malay kings here, bring people up to Fort Canning and say this is where they all lived, this is where their palace was, etc., etc. Oh, really? Yep. And this was on the trade route, you know, from China to India and the Middle East and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't realise that. Start going into those kind of things. Then you take people to interesting enclaves here in Singapore, like little neighbourhoods like Juchiat and Tiong Bahru, which are delightful. And they are not big modern buildings. In fact, here in Singapore, we've tried very hard to keep our old buildings. We have 10 conservation areas. Yeah. And of course, our land's scarce, so I can't say that we've kept everything. Have we kept enough? Well, that's a debate, but we have kept quite a lot, and we are now much more interested in trying to preserve and conserve our heritage. So there's a lot of interesting things to do here. And sterility? Absolutely not. I mean, I could take people to parts of Singapore which are noisy and dirty and, you know, frankly, complete antithesis of the sterility that people are accusing Singapore of. This is the Fullerton building. Yeah. Built in 1928.
Once we stayed here with my wife as a getaway.
Yeah.
It's Pretty,
lovely, isn't
pretty
it?
expensive.
Yeah,
and,
expensive,
but
but
super lovely.
wonderful. And I stayed
Yeah.
here once with my son because my husband had already gone off and to the US when we were moving to the US for a while, and we stayed here. And it was my choice to stay here because I wanted to be down here in the Civic District because I love it. And so yes, I have also stayed here, but I haven't stayed in many hotels in Singapore, obviously, because you know you don't when you're living here generally. Except if you do a quick staycation like as you were describing. But yeah, this is the Fullerton building, and of course this was a very impressive building for people coming in from the sea, which people did in the old days before they came in by plane into Changi Airport. They came by sea, and so it was important that they were greeted with these amazing buildings which emanated stability and strength.
Yeah.
And the Fullerton was one of these, 1928 as I say. The City Hall, which is now part of the National Gallery, 1929, very similar kind of idea. You saw them on both sides as you came in. So yeah, the old General Post Office and other government buildings, and now a super hotel.
It's also impressive when you see the photos from like the 50s and the 60s, like from here, the river.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
all the boats.
A lot of boats. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could pretty well walk from shore to shore, so to speak, by walking over the boats in the old days. Clearly, no longer. You get the occasional tourist boat and the occasional dredger coming up, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, now we're on the business side of the river, so to speak. This is the CBD over here, so that's why you've got obviously the big buildings. But the post office was always on the business side because it was so important for business.
There is no arts and culture.
Having been a guide in 3 of the museums here in Singapore, and the museum scene has flourished in recent years, since the 90s really. We're sitting right outside the Asian Civilizations Museum. I would totally dispute that we have wonderful museums here, and we're constantly adding to them. There's some private museums as well. The organisation which I headed, I had the great privilege to head for a couple of years, the Friends of the Museum, now works with I think it's 9 or 10 different organisations within Singapore. As for the arts generally, the theatre scene has also bloomed in recent years. So we have some excellent theatre here. I could name the Singapore Repertory Theatre, Pandemonium, Wild Rice, all of these theatre companies who are doing fantastic shows. And honestly, the quality of the shows are, I would say, equal to those that I've seen on Broadway and the West End and the like. So yeah, it's a smaller scene. It's nowhere near as developed as it is in, say, New York or London, again, to go back to those 2 examples. But things have moved on a great deal here. And I thoroughly enjoy the theatre here and support it a lot. I've seen excellent shows. Art, yeah, the art scene has expanded too. We now have School of the Arts here, and we have La Salle College. My son went to La Salle College and studied theatre, and he went off to do something else. He's in Amsterdam now doing sound engineering, so that's very different. But you know, the money that's been put by the Singapore government into organisations like those, into schools like those, is encouraging. And there are others. I mean, it's quite a flourishing art scene. Of course, the National Gallery, which is just across the road here, was opened in 2015 to showcase Asian art, particularly Southeast Asian art. And again, the Singapore government has put a huge amount of time and money into taking 2 beautiful old buildings and combining them into one, and you know, adaptively reusing the building for art, fine art.
If you wanna get the most out of Singapore, and like, let's say first say arts and culture, what would be the 3 places to go?
Well, the National Gallery for sure, because that is obviously our premier fine art establishment. So that definitely you should go there. And there's a lot of art to see, but it's also architecturally very interesting as a building. The way in which the 2 buildings were combined to create the National Gallery is in itself a fascinating story, right? By Monsieur Milou, the French architect. And so I think that is a must-do. We're just coming up to the Victoria Halls here, as I call them for short. There's the Victoria Concert Hall and the Victoria Theatre.
Yeah.
These are very interesting buildings too. I often bring people here because although they look the same, they were actually built in different periods.
Yeah.
They're about 50 years apart.
Yeah, and this is Sir Raffles over there.
And we have the original statue of Sir Stamford Raffles here. There's a white copy down by the river where more or less he landed, although nobody's quite sure exactly where he landed in 1819.
Yeah.
But yes, this was a statue that was made to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee.
Yeah.
Used to sit in the middle of the Padang over there, but he got hit by a lot of cricket balls and things, because that's the cricket club just over there. And so they decided they would move him somewhere sort of more salubrious. He was moved here in 1919, and he's been there ever since, and hopefully he'll be there for a long time to come.
Have you ever wanted to watch the same shows and events your friends in other countries are enjoying? Or maybe you're trying to access something on your office Wi-Fi and it's not available there. Frustrating, right? But that wouldn't be a problem with ExpressVPN, the sponsor of today's video. They are the world's largest premium VPN service provider, founded in 2009. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. So with ExpressVPN you can access content from anywhere, whether you're at the office, on vacation abroad, or just relaxing at home. It's super easy. ExpressVPN works on all your devices, including routers, which means you can even use it on your PlayStation, Xbox, or Smart TV. Plus, ExpressVPN gives you access to major streaming platforms like Netflix, offering tons of exclusive shows and movies from different countries. All you need is ExpressVPN and the legitimate subscription to enjoy all the amazing content you want. To get started with ExpressVPN, follow the link in the description below and get 3 months for free exclusively for my subscribers. Enjoy! Okay, another one is lack of sense of humor. Which for me, it's like I have a lot of Singaporean friends with awesome sense of humor.
Yeah.
And also sometimes it's not so sour, sometimes as Brits well known for this sense of humor. But Singaporeans are fine. They get the jokes. They joke themselves. I mean,
I agree with you. I think you've already answered the question really, because quite honestly, I think there are Singaporean comedians who are very funny, and I've been to many shows where some of these comedians are, sometimes they're actors as well as comedians, and very funny. Sometimes the sense of humour is a little bit different, because that sense of humour does vary a bit from country to country. It's cultural. But I think overall there's some fantastic, very funny things going on here. And I'm thinking of Wild Rice and Ivan Heng and some of the things that he's put on, which are hysterical, really funny. And and we have a number of quite well-known comedians here, and they're well followed. People go and listen to them, watch them, and people have a sense of humour. It may be something just a little bit different sometimes. Perhaps they don't get irony in the same way that we get in the West. I think we use irony a lot in the West, and maybe it's not quite used to the same extent perhaps here. But overall, I think there's just no lack of sense of humour.
What are the places that will give you like a different look or different feel on Singapore? Something that's not really, you wouldn't expect when you see it, not expect, oh, it's Singapore?
First of all, there's some of the nature parks for sure. If you took people to Sungai Buloh and blindfolded them and then took off the blindfold in the middle of Sungai Buloh and say, where are you? Very few people would say, I am in Singapore, because it's a nature reserve, it's absolutely beautiful, and you could be anywhere in tropical Asia. Well, really, obviously it's quite obvious you're not in, sort of in a colder climate or something. But and so I think places like that, Pulau Ubin maybe would be another option. It's one of the little islands. It's just off Changi. It means Granite Island in Malay, because there were granite quarries there in the past. And that's another one. You've stepped back in time when you go to Pulau Ubin. It feels like you've gone back 30, 40 years or something. So yes, it's another one. And then I think here in Chinatown, you could take people to many places where you say, this is not the super squeaky clean type of Singapore that you might be thinking about. This is quite, sort of rough and ready. Little India's a bit like that too. Quite authentic, quite rough and ready in places, but arguably more authentic, for being that way. So I think there's lots of places actually that you could bring people, and this is where we try to bring people to places which show the authentic Singapore.
We'll leave a link to the website where people can book a tour.
That would be great. Thank you very much. Yes,
sure.
That would be super.
In Juchiat, I have friends, they own the motorcycle shop there, the big brand, British brand. And once I was invited for their barbecue party. So basically they start doing the barbecue just on the street. And it was a couple of friends with me, and they were super surprised. Oh, it's allowed in Singapore.
Yeah.
So they're doing barbecue just on the street.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, and there's nothing more annoying. There's another conception again that this is a fine country. You know, there's these T-shirts that say you get fined for everything, jaywalking or spitting or whatever. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. We do not have chewing gum here, and I'm very happy about that. Having lived in New York, which spends like millions every year just taking those revolting little black blobs off the sidewalk and everything. Very happy we don't have chewing gum here. Quite frankly, who needs it? But those kind of things, again, people get these obsessions about, oh, well, in Singapore there's no freedom because you can't chew gum. Really? I think there's more to life than chewing gum. But no, I think that there's quite a lot of freedom. Yeah, I mean, some things you do have to get permission for and so forth if you're going to have a big noisy party or whatever. But okay, I mean, fair enough. I think
on a daily life basis, I don't feel like more restricted here compared to any other place I used to live. Like once, I used to live in Ireland for 3.5 years, and once we actually left for like holidays, and we forgot to do the gardening. And then the neighbor complained because one of the plants was over the fence. And I mean, it can happen anywhere in the world. I mean, it's not the problem. Also, Singapore people start watching you and then complain. No, it's not. It's not really the case.
No, I agree with you. I think it's pretty relaxed, generally speaking. I think this fine business. I still think, why on earth are they still flogging these T-shirts that say it's a fine city, fine country? Because it's like, no, you don't get fined for doing silly things. There are silly things like jaywalking and all that kind of thing. No, I mean it's
that
not
people
true.
jaywalk.
People jaywalk all the time. I mean, I'm not condoning jaywalking per se or whatever, but it's spitting I would certainly not condone. I think it's a very healthy thing to do, as we all know from SARS and COVID and everything else. But overall, no, I don't feel Big Brother's watching us at all. The police presence is very, very minimal, very light.
You don't see police
at all. You don't see police. A lot less than in somewhere, again, I go back to New York, I mean, where they're everywhere, not usually doing anything very useful, but that's by the by. It doesn't feel like a police state, doesn't feel like you're under the vigilant eye of the government or whatever. It doesn't feel, as you've said yourself.
If I've now been to Singapore, I have only 3 days. Should I go still to MBS and the Gardens by the Bay, or what would your advice?
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, the first thing you do is you book a tour with us, of course, or several tours with us, and then you're going to get you're going to get straight into the interesting things. People always want to go to MBS. Personally, I think it's better to sit here in the National Gallery, have a drink at sunset, looking at MBS, because it's more interesting to be looking at MBS, in my opinion, than actually be in MBS just looking out. That's my own opinion. But people want to go and see the infinity pool and all that kind of stuff. Okay, fine, go up there and have a drink in the evening if that floats your boat, as they say. Gardens by the Bay, I think, are good. They're interesting. It's worth going to the light show, which happens a couple of times every evening, and it's impressive what they do. It's only short, it's 15 minutes or whatever. So it's probably worth going and seeing that. Personally, I still would rather go to the Botanic Gardens, which are historic.
And
they're beautiful, and they're our only UNESCO Heritage Centre, heritage thing here. So, I would rather, personally, I think the Botanic Gardens are much more interesting from a historical point of view and so forth. But
you should choose wisely the time of the day.
Absolutely. Get up early, get out quick, beat the heat. You want to take a break in the afternoon and you want to go out again in the evening.
Hey guys, just a quick announcement. Don't skip. I'll be running a 3-day workshop called Fast Track to Views and Profits on YouTube. If you ever wanted to start your own channel, this is the best way to do it. You will learn how to choose the most profitable niche and how to beat the YouTube algorithm. You're gonna love it, I promise. Link in description, so sign up if it's for you. And now back to the video. I know some Westerners, a generalizing term, but they say okay, I feel much better being in Asia, so they prefer Asia to Europe, let's say, or to the US. Do you kind of feel the same, or you can be comfortable in both Asia and Europe, let's say?
To me, Asia is like a warm bath compared to a cold shower of Europe, and it's comfortable and easy, and you can just sort of relax into it much more. But and I went to live in the States for 6 years at one point from here.
And I have New York City.
Yeah, New York. And I have to say, when I got there, I was desperately looking out for all things Asian. So yes, I guess I really did miss Asia when I was over there, and was very happy to come back here after the 6 years of living in the US. Again, nothing against the US. My sister's lived there for 35 years. I've got lots of other friends and relatives there. But yeah, I was very happy to come back to Singapore.
What you missed the most when you lived for 6 years in New York City? What you missed from Singapore?
Oh gosh. Now, if I was Singaporean, you know what I'd say? I would say food, wouldn't I?
Food, yeah, of course.
because there's absolute obsession with food, makan here. But I know it wasn't for me. It wasn't the food. I think it's just the warmth of the people. I mean, it's not just the climate that's warm, but people are lovely here. They're really, really lovely. And you know, to be frank, in cities like New York and London and so forth, people are pretty busy and pretty stressed, and you know, I don't know. It's not quite so easy to break into their circles because everybody's got their own family there. They've got their own stuff going on. They lead very, very busy lives. I mean, don't get me wrong. I did lots of interesting stuff in all these different places I've lived, but here I find it's very easy. People are, I say, delightful. Charming. There's a charm to Asia which you just don't really get generally in other parts of the world. I think probably that's the people more than anything else.
Some people would disagree when you say like Singaporeans are, let's say, more relaxed or more chilled compared to America.
Look, at the end of the day, America is made up of many, many different kinds of places, and New York is definitely not that chill.
Yeah, exactly.
New York is a crazy, busy place, and that gives it its own unique charm in a way.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're in the Midwest somewhere, you would have a completely different experience, obviously. But I think Singaporeans, I mean, of course, they do strive for all kinds of things here in Singapore, and we all know that it's a pressure cooker of an education system and things like that. But I'm looking at the overall picture here. I think people are really quite delightful. Yes, there's a lot of pressure put upon children in particular here in the education system, as I said, and I don't think it's day-to-day life. It's not as difficult, I don't think, here as it is in some parts of the West. You don't have the climate to battle with to start with. You know, miserable days in the winter, whether it's in New York or London or other parts of the West, are really tough. The Singapore things work incredibly efficiently, so you don't have that issue, you know, oh my God, the trains are on strike again and that kind of thing that you get in certain parts, particularly in the UK. Yes, there are pressures put upon people here for sure, because it's not a cheap place to live. Singapore is obviously more expensive than most other parts of Asia because it is a first world country, and there is a lot of pressure upon you to create wealth for yourself, to be able to survive and live. And I accept all that. As I said, you know, it's nowhere in this world is perfect. There are always some negatives, if you like, or some less than positives at least. But I still think overall it's a more relaxed place than I'm picking out New York and London, as I say. I'm sure there are many relaxed places in, say, the Midwest of the USA, and also in, you know, certain parts of the UK, and obviously in Europe generally. I go to Spain quite a lot. There's lots of very relaxed places in Spain. But
I agree. I think it's the right comparison. You compare Singapore to big cities, to the cosmopolitan cities, not a small village in France.
Exactly.
I mean, you compare a small village in Thailand and a small village in France. Then the comparison makes sense.
Exactly. This is a city-state. You know, and it is a very busy place. We have a large population for the size of the island, and so on and so on. Not that it feels that way. It doesn't feel like it's tremendously overpopulated. It doesn't feel overpopulated. But it works well. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate the place. You know, things work.
I guess maybe it was more strict like 30 years ago, like in the 80s and the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a time where, you know, Singapore, after it became independent in 1965, and it had to promote itself to the world as being a very stable country for people to invest their money in. They wanted to show to the world that, you know, we haven't got any craziness going on here. And Lee Kuan Yew obviously was particularly behind that. Our father of the nation. And it's at a time when things like men coming into the country couldn't come in with long hair. At times like when the movie St. Jack came out and was immediately banned because it was showing the sort of seedy side of Singapore, and Singapore wanted to get away from that concept, because it had that image at one point of being, you know, it's sort of it's a bit of a den of iniquity, and this is where all the sailors coming off the ships came to, and all kinds of nefarious goings on were happening. But so it wanted to change its image, so it became quite sort of quite conservative, I guess, at that particular stage. But over the years, that's really relaxed tremendously. And you've got to remember that this is also at a time where Singapore came down very hard on drug use, still is very hard on drug use. And part of the reason behind that is because of the use of opium in this country. Right through to the 1980s, there was opium being smoked here, and it was an absolute scourge. It was a terrible, terrible thing. So Singapore was very, very anti-drug, partly because of its history, with drugs. And so, I mean, but it doesn't feel on day-to-day life here, as you've just said yourself, it doesn't feel like you're living under scrutiny the whole time at all.
Through these 25 years when you're here, how society changed, the self-awareness of society, of people, or behavior of people? How do you think it's changed?
One thing I'd say that is inevitable and is commented on a great deal is the fact that the younger generation obviously hasn't lived through the harder times that their parents and their grandparents had to live through. In 1965, this country was bankrupt, and it had to work incredibly hard after the Japanese occupation during World War II, after the very tough years of the 50s when it was striving for more independence, finally gets it in a sort of series of steps, if you like, in the 50s and early 60s. And then it's got to sort of build everything really from scratch. It's got to build an economy, it's got to build an infrastructure, it's got to build all the social, society and so forth, all the social issues here, everything from housing to education to health, etc., etc. And so those times are really tough, and the people of what we call the pioneer generation and so forth will remember it very well and appreciate what the government has given Singapore in terms of stability and safety and all those kinds of things that we talked about. Whereas the younger generation, obviously, I mean, it's understandable, they haven't lived through that, and therefore I think there's a lot more questions being asked about, well, can we have more of a voice? Can we how can we contribute? Which is a good thing. I mean, it's good that they want to contribute, and can we have a little bit more freedom to express our opinions? And I think that's the thing that in my opinion, again, the PAP and the government, let's say the government may not always be the PAP, but it has been for a long, long time, since 1959. Those are things that they're going to have to really deal with going forward. In the past, the challenges were clear. This is a poor country, what are we going to do? We've got to get the economy sorted out, we've got to get inward investment, we've got to set up, let's say, all the social structures, all the things I mentioned. And now it's much more subtle, these things. How do we give people more freedom? How do we give them more say? And yet at the same time make sure that this place is still attractive for overseas investment, and because overseas investors are definitely attracted to Singapore by stability, the rule of law and the like. So it's a fine balance between those two things, and I think this is what comes out more these days than 25 years ago when I first came here.
Let's say Britain is like super old society, and it went through stages, and now like you can maybe compare like Singapore society as a teenager, and like European society is more like an adult, just because of the long history. How like the society, like how people see themselves now, and like maybe we can talk about like what's the way to grow, or like how you see the future for Singapore society, how it will evolve.
Well, I think it's interesting you're comparing the age of a nation, or the maturity level of a nation, with that of a human being, because I do it a lot as well, actually. Personally, I think the USA is a teenage because it tends to react very, sort of violently from one extreme to the other, and can't quite ever find an equilibrium, in my opinion. And I think one can look and see what's going on in the States right now as a perfect illustration of that. Interestingly enough, I think somewhere like Singapore, because it has cultural influences of all these different ethnicities who come here, such as Chinese, which is obviously a very, very old civilization, Indian, Malay and so forth, I don't think it is as immature as, quite honestly, somewhere like the US, because I think, as I say, the maturity comes from all those different cultural aspects, cultural influences. Now, Singapore has made a lot of effort to create a Singaporean identity. So people no longer think of themselves, generally speaking, as being Chinese or Malay or Indian. They're Singaporean, okay? And there's been an awful lot of effort put into that.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a Singaporean? How can people feel that they are part of the decision-making process, I guess, in this country. As I say, I would like to see, personally, I would like to see more opportunity to express opinions on things here, to contribute to the country. Because quite often I feel I have some ideas, but I just don't know where you go to with those ideas.
As a foreigner,
yeah, even as a foreigner. And yes, I am a foreigner, although I've been a permanent resident here since, 23 years. Yeah, 23 years as a PR and lived here for a long time. So I don't consider myself an out-and-out. I hate the term foreigner, actually. It's an awful word, isn't it, really? It's almost as bad as being an alien in the US. But, it's like it has this connotation of being you haven't got a clue. I don't think I'm in that boat. I mean, of course I'm not true blue Singaporean, but I think I know a lot about the country and I've been here a long time. So I've got a fairly good idea. In fact, I often challenge people about the use of the term foreigner. What do you actually mean by foreigner? Do you mean somebody who is visiting here? Do you mean somebody who's here for 2 or 3 years? Do you mean somebody who's is not a Singaporean PR or citizen? Do you mean somebody who's not a What is a foreigner? Because it's a term that's bandied around all around the world, I think, without too much thought being given to it. Anyway,
and it also has this a bit of negative connotation, I think, right now especially.
You can't possibly understand what we're all about. We're different, that kind of thing. Everybody likes to think they're different. I mean, the reality is people are not that different around the world, actually. But yes, I mean, so I would like to, I do sometimes think, I've got some sometimes quite small issues, sometimes large ones. I say, I'd like to contribute. I'd like to be able to have a debate about these things, and that I think I don't really see how to do that, to be frank. So that, I think, is something, as I said before, I think the challenges for the government going forward are going to be how can people feel that they have a say in their country, they want to have a say in the country, and care about the country and, have skin in the game, as they say, and yet at the same time keep this place in a steady trajectory, going forward. And I think that, as I say, is a much more subtle challenge going forward than the challenges of the past.
Can you name maybe a few things that you would like to, let's say, if you have a chance to discuss or to debate?
For example, I would love to know what the criteria is in Singapore for people becoming permanent residents and citizens, because I think it's a mystery to everybody. And frankly, I don't think it needs to be a mystery. I don't think there's a need for that. I think if you can't justify your decision making, then there's something probably wrong with your decision making. So I would like to see a little bit more transparency around that kind of thing, for example. I'd like to see people walking the talk in terms of things like the environment more here. There's an awful lot of talk about the environment here, and I think as a country we do care. We plant a lot of trees and all those kind of things. At the same time, there are people seemingly getting away with chopping down trees with impunity. So it's like, come on, what's all that about, So I'd like to see a little bit more of again, action-oriented discussion going on around those kinds of things. I would love to think that anybody coming to this country should really, particularly if they're going to be here, if they want to become a PR or a citizen, should actually demonstrate an interest in and knowledge of this country. I don't think, of course, we don't have a language issue here. Like in some countries, if you go to live in the country, then you have to learn to speak the language. Fair enough. That's not an issue here because English is still the main lingua franca. But, rather than people just coming in here and dumping their money here and having no interest or concern about the country, I'd like to see, well, come on, actually, if you really want to come in here and really you want to be a PR, you want to be a citizen, then I think you should actually show that you have some interest and be taught something about the country before you're given such status. I think to become a citizen you do have to go through, I don't know, because I've tried twice to become a citizen and failed twice, and I have no idea why, going back to transparency, which I think is a bit sad. And but never mind, I've been a PR for many years. It's much more difficult to become a PR or a citizen these days because there's so much more demand, of course, for it. But again, I'd like to understand what the criteria is. What is this country trying to do? We are predominantly Chinese ethnically, and we're around, we hover between 70 and 75% Chinese ethnicity. Fine, closer to 75, I think, most of the time. But how are we going to keep that up going forward? Because the birth rate is incredibly low. Do we want to literally import a lot of people in from China? That hasn't always been super successful, shall we say? I don't care, but Singaporeans don't like a lot of people just being dumped on them from mainland China. So how's that going to work going forward? If particularly amongst the Chinese group, the birth rate is particularly low. So there are some interesting issues there. And do we have to hang on to the 75% Chinese ethnicity? Is it an absolute, set in stone marker that we must always have? Don't know. Can we discuss?
Yeah. Sometimes I feel that, let's say, you have Dubai now. They have a clear vision for the next like 30 years because Dubai is like raising, the economy is growing. And Singapore is already on the top. Yeah. It's already there. Yeah. And before was Lee Kuan Yew, was like super strong, smart leader. They had this vision and people follow this vision of him. And now Singapore is already there. Yeah. So what's next?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think this is the point that I'm saying about the challenges for the government are that much more subtle going forward, because up to now, well, up till relatively recently, it was quite clear what Singapore needed to do, particularly in the early days of independence. Yeah, it needed to build its economy and all those other things that I mentioned before. And now it's okay. It's got there. It's done it. And now what? How do you maintain people's motivation? People's love of the country and all those kind of things. As I say, I think part of that, at least, it would be to give people the opportunity to contribute to the future, to the discussion on the future.
Yeah. What do you think the biggest challenges for Singapore in the future?
Yeah, I think remaining relevant, really, as a very small country. There's obviously competition in the region. I mean,
especially after COVID.
Yeah.
Because before it was like people, let's say expats, really wanted to be in like the places like Singapore or Hong Kong. Yeah. But when COVID happened, people realized, they can be in Bali, they can be in Thailand, they can be in KL, cheaper, kind of not the same quality of life, but cheaper nature and stuff, and working remotely. I talked to some friends, they do business here and F&B business, and they see that some negative trends because there are less people who want to spend time and money in Singapore compared to, I'd rather go to Phuket, spend money there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, we have a big wealth disparity in the country, and that is an issue. I think we have a lot of millionaires here. We have a lot of people with a lot of money, but at the same time, we have a lot of people who don't have very much money, and it's a tough place to live if you don't have very much money, because it's an expensive place to live. Not everything is expensive. You can live a fairly frugal life. You can, eat in hawker stalls and food courts and so forth, and you get subsidised housing. Most people own their own homes here, which is a great thing. The government has been very supportive of people of high home ownership. So it's not like everything. The public transport is excellent. You don't have to have a car here. There are many. You can lead a simpler, more frugal life, but still overall, unfortunately, the wealth disparity does seem to be growing here, and I think that's something that Singapore really again has to think about, because that's not good in a developed country to have that kind of wealth disparity. Yeah, I mean, even tourism, which I work in that sphere, is affected by this. People will only come to Singapore sometimes for a limited amount of time because it's expensive to stay here. It's expensive, hotels are expensive and so forth. So you have to think about those kinds of things. You don't want to price yourself out of the market, basically. Yeah. So I think that's one of the challenges for the future. And as I said before, also, you've mentioned F&B. The huge challenges here for people running F&B, particularly the service industries, because of lack of staff. And why is there a lack of staff here? Well, because there have been a lot of rules and regulations put in about having a minimum number of Singaporeans. We all want to make sure that Singaporeans have enough work here, but we have zero unemployment. So really, why are we worrying about this? It's the equivalent to Californians saying we don't want Mexicans. Well, you're going to go out and pick the crops? Well, no. Okay, so come on, be realistic. A lot of Singaporeans are well educated. They don't want to do these service type jobs, and so why not let people come in from the Philippines and Indonesia and everywhere else and to do these things?
What's interesting, there is no clear city center in Singapore.
Right.
There is this area, there is CBD, there is Orchard, and they all there is no clear a center.
Well, it's interesting because in the old days, of course, Raffles Place was the centre for everything. That's where all the big
Raffles
shops were.
Place, Okay.
Robinson's, John Little, and all these big shops were in Raffles Place, which is just around the corner, which of course is the centre of the business district. It was called Commercial Square in the old days, and so it was really the centre of everything at one point. And then it was felt that actually there's opportunities in Orchard, just north of here, to create businesses, create retail opportunities and so forth particularly. So those were developed later on. But at one point this is where everybody would come down to Raffles Place.
What do you feel now when you go back to the UK? When you're there, what's your feelings?
I feel very disappointed in the Brexit decision, and I think it reflects very badly on the country. And so I truly am disappointed in my fellow Brits, if you like. Mind you, it was only half of them. But the fact was that not many people, there was complacency there. And a lot of people didn't bother voting. And it's like, come on guys, this is ridiculous. You must always exercise your right to vote. I like that Singapore makes it mandatory voting, actually. I think it's a very good thing, as does Australia. Because, people have died for the right to vote. For God's sake, use your vote. Doesn't matter if you vote for somebody I don't like, doesn't matter, but you at least have been part of the democratic process. So I go back and feel, a lot of people didn't bother voting through apathy or complacency or whatever, and those who did vote, I think, unfortunately, a lot of people who actually benefited tremendously from the EU voted to leave the EU, which is like bizarre. And one can say it was badly explained. Referendums in countries like Switzerland, where they have them all the time, are much better handled because people are actually get the facts and so forth. And an awful lot of sheer outright lies were told in that whole pre-Brexit vote. And I think that's super disappointing that people were so gullible as to actually believe those. So I have a disappointment in my country for that. It varies. Scotland voted to stay, Northern Ireland voted to stay. I do think the education systems are very good in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Maybe there's a correlation. I don't know. There's a flip comment really, but overall it's still a wonderful country. There's still an awful lot of great things there. You mentioned earlier on the maturity of the country, the mother of parliaments and so on and so forth. It has a tremendous tradition of fair-mindedness overall. There's a lot of great things about the UK, but that's the one thing that really has disappointed me tremendously, is that small-mindedness, the xenophobia and all the rest of it that came into that decision by a lot of people.
What was the reasoning behind applying for the citizenship? I know a few Americans who actually give up their citizenship and they became Singaporeans, but I know only one British who did that.
Yeah.
Because you can be British and be in PR like forever, basically.
Yes, you can. I am British and I have been a PR since for 23 years. So yes, I'm an example of that. Well, no, the Americans, often it's because of the worldwide taxation and so forth. It's part of the reason, although not always. Some of them literally do want to commit themselves to this part of the world. Well, I think it's that commitment to the country. As far as I have been concerned, we have always said that we would be happy to live here the rest of our lives. It's a great place to live, and we love the country. We think it's all the reasons I've mentioned already for why we love the country, and why not live here? It's a great place to live. So we thought, right, rather than rely on the permanent residency, which has to be renewed every 5 years. I mean, there was a time we used to give you 10 years, but no more longer. Anyway, now it's every 5 years, and you never know. It's not a done deal that you're going to get a renewal. And it's possible even that PR-ship could be done away with completely at some point in the future. So we said, well, then if we want to live here forever, the best thing would be to become citizens. And so we tried and failed.
It's also like regarding the PR, because the PR is permanent residency. And let's say if you get a PR in UK or in Portugal or in France, it's like forever. You get it, let's say after 5 years, so there's 6 years, there's a clarity. Okay, we'll talk about it. There's the status that you don't need to extend. It's like for life. But in Singapore, you still extend like every 5 years. Technically, I don't know anyone who actually was rejected, but definitely there is a chance.
There is a chance, and at the end of the day, given that there are so many people who want to become PRs here, it may simply be a numbers issue eventually. So again, this is, I think, part of how do we want the mix of the population to be here going forward? I have heard of people being rejected not rejected for PR, but they're having their renewals rejected. And technically speaking, you are a permanent resident. If you stay in Singapore and never leave the country, you are permanently resident here. It's fine. You never need to do anything. It's your re-entry pass that you actually have to renew every 5 years. So technically speaking, you could say, you're a PR, you're a PR. Literally permanent. But let's say, take Hong Kong as an example. Once you become a PR there, as long as you go back there every 3 years, then you retain your permanent residency for life. And we don't have that here. And so, yes, who knows? It's always possible that the decision may be, well, we don't actually want these PRs anymore. They're a bit of a nuisance. They're neither one thing nor the other. It's possible. It's been talked about in the past. I'm not saying that's going to happen necessarily, because PRs obviously have to do national service and all those kind of things. So, in some ways, it's a wonderful route to citizenship, or it should be, but obviously not always. So yeah, I mean, our personal reasons were that we thought we would like to be here forever, and you know, we'd like to have the certainty of being citizens.
What's your the favorite place in Singapore? I mean, there are probably so many, but something like very special for you, and maybe not so obvious.
Oh, that's very, very difficult. Actually, I do love this area here. This is what we call the Civic District, because this is where all the government buildings are and have been in the past. And I do like this particular area because we've got some amazing architecture. You mentioned Asian Civilizations Museum, Victoria Halls, just talked about, and so on and so forth. I think there's a sense of history here. Essentially, this is the part of the island that Sir Stamford Raffles signed for when he came here in 1819. It was rather beautifully sort of described as being within a cannon shot of the water. Exactly what a cannon shot is subject to interpretation, but I believe it's something like half a mile. So this is the part that he really came to trade in, and he was trading. It wasn't colonial. He wasn't colonizing it in 1819. It became a colony much later on. So I'm very fond of the Civic District. I also love Fort Canning.
Fort Canning, yeah, I love it.
Mentioned it very briefly earlier on. I like the fact that you've got the 14th century history there, you've got the colonial history there, you've got the 20th century, you've got military history there. So I really do like Fort Canning very much. But you know, there are some beautiful parks here. I mentioned Makritchie a moment ago. I love Makritchie Reservoir, Sungai Buloh. Oh my gosh, you know, the list is quite long really. And then some of the quirky neighbourhoods like Tiong Bahru and Jutiat and so forth are fabulous as well. Yeah, they're not the most obvious ones. I mean, people tend to come here, I want to go to the 3 ethnic neighbourhoods, being Chinatown, Little India and Kampong Glam, the Malay area. Go, okay, fine, they're interesting too, but personally I find some of these other places more interesting. I was only coming up 7 when we actually came across. I still remember vividly arriving in Singapore and how colourful it was, and all the different, it was an assault on the senses, you know, as Asia is, in terms of colour, smells, sights, sounds, everything. And yeah, it's very vivid in my memory still, arriving here in February 1963 to live, as I say, in what was then Malaya, which is now part, of course, of Malaysia. And we lived here for a few years, and I went to school in JB, and as did my sister, my younger sister, and we loved it, absolutely loved living here. And what's not to love? It's warm. As children, you run around in nothing more than a light dress or a pair of shorts or something. I've learned to swim and just did some exploring within Malaya. We went all over the country, went up to Penang and KL and Malacca and places, stayed in what they called rest houses in those days. There weren't nothing quite so sophisticated as a hotel, generally speaking. There were a few, but generally not. And came here to Singapore a lot. And of course, in those days, basically the countries were treated as one country. Even though Malaya had got its own independence in 1957, in effect they were one country. So it was easy. You zipped across the causeway, you came to Singapore, you went shopping, you went to the movies, whatever you wanted to do. And back you went again in the same day, no problem at all. Unlike, unfortunately, today, a little bit trickier crossing the causeway these days, or our second crossing even. And then, of course, 1965 came when Malaysia was formed, and that, 63 came, September 63, when Malaysia was formed. That made it even easier. It was then, you know, formal that we were part of the same country, until 65, August 65, when Singapore came out of Malaysia, which then made life a little trickier because all of a sudden we had to go through immigration and customs and the like going across the causeway. So yeah, you know, I feel that having lived through those years, I really do have a personal appreciation of what went on, as well as an academic appreciation, which, if you like, I have gained from being a guide here in 3 of the museums in Singapore, and now doing what I do, you know, promoting Singapore as an interesting place to come to.
Did you go to a local school?
It was a British Army school, actually. British Army school in JB, Johor Bahru, and later on that became Malaysian Army School. And then later on it became an international school, and it is still an international school. I've been over to check it out, see if it's still around. All the old buildings have gone, it's changed completely, but it is still an international school in Johor Bahru.
I guess JB changed even more than Singapore.
I think Singapore has changed more, really. Put it this way, back in the 60s, when you crossed the causeway, JB, Malaysia and Singapore were more or less at the same level of development. You really couldn't distinguish between the two. When I came back here on a couple of business trips in the mid-90s, I persuaded my colleagues that it'd be a good idea to go across over to JB. And I must admit, I was rather taken aback to see what a difference there was. And this is, about 30 years ago, so things have moved on even further since then. Obviously, Johor is a part of Malaysia which is trying to become an economic development zone, so they're making a lot of effort to try to sort of try to modernise it, trying to put in better communications and so forth and so on and so forth. But essentially, it's still not at the level of Singapore, to be frank. And it's a pity in a way, because I have a great fondness for Malaysia, having lived there. I was just in Penang last week, and I feel there's a nice ambience, if you like, when you go to these countries. A little bit different.
What are the main principles in life for you? Like something really important that you develop, some principle that you develop through your life?
I think I have quite a strong sense of justice, fairness. I hate to see injustices done to people, and unfortunately that happens all the time, all over the world. I do believe that maybe again part of my British upbringing is fair play. One should try to always strive to be honest and open and fair in one's dealings with other people. I think that's a very prime principle. I think kindness is very important in this world. There's an awful lot of unkindness around. We only have to look and see around the world and see all the things that are happening. And that would be kindness, not just to each other on a level playing field, but also to vulnerable people and creatures. I'm a great animal person. I hate to see cruelty to animals. I hate to see cruelty to anything vulnerable, actually, old people, children, whatever, the vulnerable, the people who really, can't always, stand up for themselves or combat that cruelty that's being imposed upon them. So I'm very, that would be another thing, I guess, kindness, particularly to the more vulnerable.